Welcome back to the Unnamed Game Co. World Building Series, Episode 3. Okay, so how? Part 2, Stories, Tropes, and Stereotypes. Could I make the title longer? Probably. I probably could do that. My name is Caradwin. I use they, them pronouns, and if you haven't seen Episode 1 and 2, you probably should because they lay the groundwork for everything we're talking about today. And if you have seen Episode 1 and 2 and you came back for Episode 3, thank you. I appreciate that. So today we're talking about stories, tropes, and stereotypes. As we discussed briefly in genre, there's going to be a lot of influences that we're drawing from, which are going to have an impact on the stories that we're telling and what we're putting into our game. And some of those things will be awesome and great, and some of them will be less awesome, and some of them are downright dangerous and bad. So here's a brief content warning before we get into it. Today I'm going to be talking about some difficult topics like racism, bigotry, hatred in general, and I'm not an expert in any of these topics. What I am sharing with you are my experiences and my perspectives, but you should absolutely use this as inspiration to do your own investigation so that you can find out more information from people who are experts and can share more accurate representations because they've experienced more of it than I have. I'm not here to give a lecture, but I am going to share some of my personal philosophy, and I hope that we can have a productive conversation in the comments and that we can move forward in a respectful way because we all have opportunities for growth, myself included. So I'm hoping that I can learn from you and you can learn from me and we can do better to make games better because at the end of the day, that's why we're here, because we want to build better worlds so that we can have better games. So let's start with our stories. We talked a little bit about genres and the influences, and one of the places where our genre is going to influence us the most is in our stories. So what is a story? Well, the internet defines a story as an account of imaginary or real people and events told for entertainment. And that pretty much lines up with what we're doing. We are building stories into our world so that we can convey some information. We're focusing on the imaginary because we're doing games and we're operating in fiction. But there is a really important distinction that I want to make here between stories and your plot. Because sometimes these things get muddled, and while they definitely influence each other, they are not the same thing. So what is a story, and what is a plot, and how do they relate to world building? Well, I'm going to define it as I think of it, which there's lots of different ways to define it, but here's my view. For me, the plot of a game has to be actionable. There have to be stories that you are interacting with that don't have a conclusion yet. So there are still things to be done to make that story happen. Maybe the story is in the middle, or maybe your characters are initiating the story. But if it's a plot, then it's a story that doesn't already have an ending. And when I'm doing my plot building, I do a lot of character tie-ins because I want my characters and my players to be invested in the stories that we are telling. So when I build my plot, I'm integrating those characters and their backstories into what that story is going to be. And while that story may lead towards the conclusion of the game, perhaps the one that I want, I haven't necessarily decided how this story is going to end. This plot is being used as a tool for the players to tell the story with me, and we are going to be working together to find out what the end is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that my plot is dictating what the end is going to be. This is different from how I use stories in my world building. So when there are stories in my world building, they are passive. They are stories about things that have already happened, and they almost always have lots of different perspectives and different versions of the truth. Because when you're hearing stories that have been told multiple times by different people, some of them hear it secondhand, thirdhand, or some of them have had this story passed on through the generations, each iteration of the story is going to be a little bit different, and there are going to be features of it which are not necessarily going to match together well, and those inconsistencies become part of the mysteries that the characters are going to be solving through their roleplay and through their experience of playing the game. And while these world-building stories are going to support the main plot, they are not the main plot. They are tools that I'm using as a world builder to help the characters find out information so that they can make decisions, but pre-existing stories that already have a beginning and middle and end are not the main plot. And this is another important way that your world building is going to differ when you're doing a game world versus a book world, because when you're doing the game world, you have to have these different types of stories that you're engaging with. The stories in your world building versus your plot building are going to be part of the environment, and you're using those pre-existing stories to enhance your collaborative storytelling. The world building stories are there as tools for your characters to use, and they're not necessarily telling them what to do or what they have to do next. However, they're inviting them to role play and use the information that they have to collaboratively tell the story as they move forward. So let's talk a little bit about the typical structure of a narrative. Normally, when you have a story, like for a book or a movie, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and an end. But in a role-playing game, you're dealing more with an inciting incident that the players respond to, which then have consequences. And in my opinion, the really successful games are going to then use the consequences of the player actions as the inciting incident for your next adventure or your next adventure arc. And that's what creates that sort of episodic nature that we have in gaming. And none of this is world building. This is all plot kind of stuff with the inciting incidents and the actions and the consequences. So you have this overarching narrative, which ties all the different episodic things together. And once the game is concluded, you will be able to take a long view and say, oh, this was the beginning, this is the middle, and this is the end. But it's made up of all of these little episodic sessions that don't necessarily have an end, but they do have an arc and a flow to them. The world building piece, that comes before the game begins. And this isn't to say that you're not going to be continuing to build stories into your world as you go. World building is a living, evolving process, but in general, the world building stories should be about things that happened before the game started. These should be the stories that the characters are learning about, not necessarily the things that they're doing something with, but they will have tie-ins to what the characters are doing. So to put this in maybe an easier way, there are stories that are written and there are stories that are created. And the stories that are created are the things that happen in your plot with your characters, and the stories that are already written are the things that the game master is deciding before or during the gameplay, which the characters cannot change. And they're definitely related to each other because these world stories are going to be part of your encounters. They're going to be things that your NPCs know about. They're going to have the mysteries that your characters are solving. So they're definitely related to each other, but they're not the same thing. When we're building our stories for our worlds, we want to make sure that we are constructing stories that focus on what has happened, and not writing the story of what may happen or what we want to happen, because that's plot and we want our players to be able to interact with us collaboratively. So we don't want to write the ending of the game. We want to define what has already happened in the world when we're building our world, and then let the players collaboratively work with you to tell the story of the gameplay. So when we're dealing with our stories, there are some pitfalls that can occur. Cutscene syndrome, tropes, and stereotypes are the three sort of pitfalls that we're going to talk about today, although there are, of course, more that I'm missing. But these are the big ones when you have a very strong story focus in your world building, which can create problems as you go through your gameplay. So first, let's talk about cutscene syndrome, which I don't know if I made up that term or if I heard it before, but here's what it means to me. When I am playing in a game and we go through an encounter and then we report back to the NPCs and then the NPCs have a dramatic conversation with each other and I spend half an hour listening to the game master talk about all these really cool things that the NPCs are doing, I'm not playing that game. I am observing that game. It's like when you're playing an online game and you finish a quest, you turn it in, and then you're in a cutscene where your character is standing there in their goofy armor while all of the really pretty people talk about stuff and do things, and maybe they fight a dragon, and then maybe you start the next encounter. But during that cutscene, you are just observing. That's how you get players as audience. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not a really great way to do world building and storytelling. If your world building is saying, okay, well, we're going to build our plot into the world, well, if the plot is built into the world, then you are writing a book and you're letting your players roll some dice in between your chapters. More interesting is when your players are the actors. They are the characters of the story, and they are the ones who are doing the important actions. And this doesn't mean that you can't have NPCs and they can't do cool stuff. It means that your NPCs need to be embedded with your player characters so that as they are doing things, your NPCs are supporting the play. And you can certainly have things that the players cannot interact with that they are observing. You can have things that are big and dramatic that, they observe from a tower and they can't actually do anything about, but it's giving them important information and exposition. That's absolutely fine. But when most of the time the cool stuff is being done by people who aren't the players, then you're falling into that cutscene syndrome. But luckily, there are some things that you can do. If you think that you are falling into this cutscene syndrome problem, you can just acknowledge it. Like, be aware of what you're doing. And that's going to give you the opportunity to review why it's happening. Why is this occurring? What are my players not doing? What am I not doing as a GM? And how can we fix it? Because you might need to make some changes about how you are telling your story and what kind of stories you're using. And if your stories are overshadowing what the stories of your players are, then maybe you need to ease off from your world stories and focus more on those player stories. And really consider the impact that you are having on your game when you're doing these big expository things and telling your story, because if your players aren't interacting with it, you can't tell whether or not they're having fun. And maybe they are. It's entirely possible that you have a group of players who are like, actually, we really like just following the story that you're telling about these NPCs, and we're fine with it. We like it. And that's totally fine. Or you might have a bigger problem where maybe they don't feel confident interacting. Maybe they don't feel comfortable interjecting because they don't want to interrupt you, or maybe they're just shy and they need an invitation. Or maybe they don't think that they should. Maybe they don't think that they're supposed to because, they're new to gaming and they don't know that they're allowed to interact. Whatever the problem is, you won't know until you ask. And as a game master, sometimes we feel pressured to be the leader to have all the answers. But it's also really important to acknowledge the fact that you are still a person. You're a human being who's trying to have fun with your friends, just the same as your players are human beings who are trying to have fun with you. And when you are finding yourself in a place where you're not getting interaction with your players, then it's okay to have that conversation. By acknowledging your concerns and your frustrations, you're opening up your player table to also express their concerns and their frustrations, and that can lead to a very productive dialogue. And it might just be as simple as you saying, I want you to do more, or I want interaction. How can I support you in interacting? And then they can think about it and maybe come to you in private or have a conversation right there at the table. It comes lots of different forms because everybody's different. But being honest and open is how you're going to avoid this cutscene syndrome and make your storytelling really collaborative, because that's the point. We want a collaborative story. Another challenge that you can face as you're using these stories is having too many tropes, right? Tropes, which are defined as a recurring theme or motif, as in literature or art, are very common in gaming. We all use tropes. It's just kind of part of the game. You might think of them more as cliches, right? These are things like the damsel in distress and the chosen one and the girl next door. And I've used a lot of character examples, but you can also have story examples like there's an evil king or there's an uncle who is trying to take over power. Like, we have these stories which recur over and over again. And a lot of these tropes come from the genres that we've chosen. And I want to be very clear here that not all tropes are bad. Sometimes it's really good to have a trope in your game because it creates a shorthand for conveying a lot of information with a very small number of words. It's just important to know what you're doing and why. So we sort of check our tropes against the same thing. We acknowledge that we are using a trope, be aware of what tropes in my genre might be influencing my story, and then review it. Consider, why am I using this trope and what does it do for me? What am I getting from it? And if I'm not getting anything from this trope, if there's not a reason to use it, then maybe I need to make changes. I need to replace it, or I can do something clever. You can subvert a trope to make it something unexpected, and then people are like, wow, hey, I didn't expect that. Because just like we talked about with our logical conclusions, if you have something that people are expecting and then something breaks and it's different, that's fun, that's exciting, that's engaging. However, some tropes have been around so long that subverting the trope itself is a trope. Like when you go to rescue the damsel in distress and she's actually, a really good fighter. Wow. Oh, you sure subverted my expectations. Like it's tired, it's been done, and it's not exciting anymore. And this also leads into some of the impact that you can have with these tropes, where what something looks like might actually be more insidious, because some of these tropes actually feed into stereotypes and perpetuate hateful representations, and you might not even realize it. So let's talk about stereotypes. It should go without saying, but stereotypes are bad. And it's weird that I have to tell you that. But, like, I feel like I have to stress this point. Stereotypes are not okay, and you shouldn't use stereotypes. I really don't understand why that's a difficult concept, but it is for some people. Stereotypes are not good. They're not okay. You shouldn't use them. So what is a stereotype? Well, something conforming to a fixed or general pattern, especially a standardized mental picture that is held in common by members of a group and that represents an oversimplified opinion, prejudiced attitude, or uncritical judgment. Bigotry. Stereotypes feed into bigotry. And these are things like the gay villain, women are only strong because of their trauma, men are only motivated to do good because of violence to women, minorities are poor, lazy, stupid, your weight equates to your morality. These are patently false. And they are also really prevalent in sci-fi and fantasy. Think about how many video games or movies or TV shows you've watched where the main character is a cisgendered, heterosexual white male, and something bad happens to his wife, his girlfriend, his daughter, and then he goes on a rampage to kill all of the bad guys. That is a grossly oversimplified representation of what motivates men to take action. There are lots of things that motivate people to do stuff, and you don't have to hurt women to get guys to do good things or to defeat evil. Like, that's an unfair and prejudiced attitude that says, oh, men have to have something bad happen to the women in their lives for them to do anything. Or like weight being equivalent to your value or morality. When you watch a show or something and you see, well, everyone who's a good guy is beautiful and thin, and everyone who's a bad guy is fat and ugly. What that is showing is that, well, good people are thin and attractive, and bad people are fat and ugly. As a fat person, that does not make me feel good. And there's the issue of races where, orcs and goblins and gnolls and hobgoblins, they're just evil because they're just born evil and they do evil things. And that rhetoric and the kinds of depictions of those races is pretty much exactly what has been used to denigrate races of people in the real world. So when we as game masters and world builders perpetuate these stereotypes, we are unintentionally, most of the time I hope, feeding into this long history of creating prejudice through representation of falsehoods. And we don't want to do that. So you have to acknowledge that there are stereotypes that exist in the genres that you're using, and look out for those stereotypes in your worlds and in your story, and think about, how you can do something about that. Why is that there? What is the purpose of it? Because there really aren't a lot of good reasons for using a stereotype. A stereotype is, by definition, an oversimplification. And if something is overly simplified, then it's uninteresting, and that makes for a bad world. So you really need to consider what that purpose is of that stereotype, and then review it, modify it, make it better. Because as you start expanding on that stereotype and creating nuance and interest and depth, and you are starting to dismantle that stereotype, you are also creating a more engaging, exciting, and inviting and safe world, both in-game and out. Because the bias that you bring to the table, others might take from the table. And you have bias. I have bias. We all have bias. You cannot avoid having a bias. And what I'm trying to say here is not that you're a bad person or I'm a bad person. What I'm trying to say is that we need to be critical from an internal perspective about our bias. We need to be mindful of what we're saying and what we're showing and how that might affect other people. And there's a big argument that I hear whenever I talk to people about this. I hear this a lot, but it's fantasy. These people think, well, because it's a fantasy world, I don't have to worry about racism and bigotry and homophobia and misogyny because it's a made-up world. It's fine. And this is where I'm going to share some of my personal philosophy. I don't care that it's fantasy. You are a real person in the real world running a real game for real people, which means your real actions can have a real impact whether or not your setting is fantasy. The way I see it, if you do not work to prevent harm, you will cause harm. And I'm not saying that anyone is doing this intentionally. I'm saying that you will accidentally hurt people if you are not aware that you might hurt people. And I am certainly not infallible. I have definitely made mistakes, and I have done things in game which have hurt people out of game, and I regret that, and I learn from it, and I do better. Because I want to run a game that is fun, and that means running a game that is safe, which means recognizing when I'm doing things wrong, and that means I'm getting in the habit of identifying those mistakes before I make them, even though it's a fantasy game. Even though it's all made up and it's not real. I try to make sure that I'm aware of where I'm coming from and what I'm doing, and I take steps to educate myself, to learn about the things that I do not know, which is really hard. It's tough to know what you don't know. But if you're not willing to do that work, then you are going to be running a game that might hurt people. And that's sad. Because you put a lot of time and energy and effort into creating this awesome thing, and you want to share it, but you don't want to hurt people with it, and you don't want to perpetuate these problematic falsehoods, these lies, these misrepresentations on accident. So you have to acknowledge them, review them, modify them, and evaluate the impact. Listen to voices of people who are not like you, so that you can broaden your knowledge, broaden your experience. And when you see other people doing things that are problematic, call it out. Have a conversation with them. Because even if it doesn't hurt you, it might hurt the person sitting next to you at the table, and they might be too afraid or too in pain to say anything about it. And maybe this is just a little touchy-feely, but we are a community. We are a community of gamers, of world builders, of game runners, and of people. We share passions, hobbies, and interests. And when we are building our stories and creating our worlds, we want to make sure that we are making them inviting, exciting, accessible, and entertaining. Because stories are, by definition, for entertainment. So I think that's where we're going to end the episode. I know it got a little heavy there at the end, but I think it's really important because when we're building our worlds, we do have the opportunity to do better than the people who came before us. And a lot of the people who wrote things back in the 70s, which have inspired a lot of games, they didn't have the same knowledge about how they can impact the world in positive and negative ways. And now as a world builder, you have a chance to make new stories, better stories, build worlds that are full of opportunities to do great and amazing and wonderful things without excluding people, without causing harm, and without perpetuating lies and causing people to not have a good time. You have the power to make a positive impact through the stories that you are telling. So that's the end of our episode 3, part 2, stories, tropes, and stereotypes. And next time in episode 4, we're going to talk about creating villains, which is good because a lot of villains fall into tropes and stereotypes. And we'll talk about how to deal with that and what some of the common ones are. So thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, please do the like thing, do the subscribe thing. And if you would care to stick around, we are going to take a trip to the Cascadon Corner. So when I started making Cascadon back in, 2010, I was definitely less worldly, less aware. I mean, I was fresh out of college and just there was a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know anything about. And I was so busy trying to survive that I was pretty much oblivious to a lot of the things that were going on. So I built into my world something that is problematic. And that is that I have the Mad Queen. And the Mad Queen is a stereotype and a trope that goes back through a lot of literature. And it's problematic because there's this idea that, women in power can't be trusted because they go crazy. And this idea that mental illness is evil and people who have mental illnesses are bad. And both of those things are untrue. and dangerous, and those are lies that I don't want to perpetuate. And while I know all of the reasons and justifications to explain why the queen is mad, I have to acknowledge that that is a stereotype in my game. And the reasons for her madness are based on the historical inspirations for some of my stories, where she worships one of the deities of vanity, power, and hierarchy, which makes sense for a queen, right? And because of this obsession with vanity, she's constantly using these lead makeups and mercury makeups, and these are toxic, which, I mean, literally, they cause people to go insane, in the colloquial term. They cause mental illnesses by degrading people's mental faculties. The mercury that hatters used made them mad as a hatter. Like, that's just a thing that happened because mercury is incredibly toxic. The lead in makeups and things like that. People would put belladonna in their eyes to make their pupils look big. That's a poison! That will kill you. And even today, we inject our faces with Botox to remove our wrinkles. So we have a very long history of using toxic and poisonous and dangerous things to try and make ourselves more beautiful. And this madness is being made worse by a cursed artifact, which is in her tower, which is a part of a different plot that I'm not going to give away because my players follow this little series, so I don't want to give that secret away. But so she has these things, these justifications for why she is the way she is. But this is a stereotype that I need to be mindful of. So as I'm telling the story of Cascadon and giving my players the context of why she is the way she is, I very openly explain the historical context of why she has gone insane, why she has lost her mind, why she's developed this mental illness. Because I don't want my players at the table to feel like I am saying, oh, people with mental illnesses are evil, because that's not true. And mental illnesses are something that happen quite often in people, and they're challenges that those folks are dealing with. And the last thing they need is to go to play a game to have some fun and be faced with, this once again perpetuated stereotype of, oh, well, crazy people are evil. And there are people who play my game who might have mental illnesses that I don't know about. Because as a game master, I'm not privy to the health details of my players. So if I'm not aware of what I'm doing, and if I don't give that context, then I might be causing harm to someone at the table, because they might feel like I'm saying, oh, well, you have a mental illness, you're a bad person. And that's not what I'm saying at all. So I'm always make it very clear that that's not my goal. I always make it very clear that even though the people of Cascadon, they have a medieval level understanding of these things, they call her the Mad Queen, they don't understand the context. But I, as the game master, as the person, as the world builder, I recognize that she is not just crazy because she's a woman in power, and she's not evil because of that. Like, I understand that there's nuance here. I've done research. I have reasons for what I'm doing. I'm not doing this to be harmful. I'm addressing that stereotype out of character, out of game, up front when I start the game. And I've certainly thought about making changes to this. I could absolutely just have the queen be dead. I could do that. I could just write that entire stereotype out of my game. But when I do my review process and think about what purpose it serves, I do decide to include it every time I think about it. Because one of the things that you can do when you have a trope or a stereotype is you can get in the habit of dismantling them. You can set up an expectation of, oh, well, these people are bad. And then immediately counter that with evidence to the contrary. Because most of the time, as the world builder, when I start adding the nuance and fleshing things out, I am going through the practice of dismantling these oversimplified prejudice perspectives. And that's something that I can share with my players, and that helps them to explore mysteries in my world and the stories in my world. And getting in the habit of asking questions and not assuming truth is really important, because I think this is a little personal mini rant, but I think it's so stupid that when you go to play a video game, all the NPCs just help you. And if they lie, they like twirl their mustache while they're doing it to make sure that you know that they're lying. Like, that's not what it's like in the real world. In the real world, you will have somebody absolutely look you dead in the eye and tell you a complete falsehood that they believe is 100% true. And part of critical thinking and gameplay and problem solving and puzzle solving is dependent on your ability to question, to inquire, and to pick apart these things that people just say as though it's just accepted to be true, and instead look deeper, look beyond that. And that makes a more interesting world. That makes a more interesting game. That makes the role play more diverse. And people will get different things out of it as they do this kind of investigation. So I keep the Mad Queen, and I keep her as this reminder of the evils of vanity, and I keep her as a reminder of the dangers of letting people be ostracized, and I let my players know that I'm not saying XYZ, and I let them find out what I do want to say with it. And I think that that's an okay way to go. And if I ever did have a player at the table who was like, you know what, I'm really not comfortable with that, then I would work around it. You know, like, I can definitely run a game without the Mad Queen being a central plot figure. We can definitely run a game where we don't have to mention it. We don't have to bring it up. We can avoid that. That's not a problem. But I want my players to have a chance to tell me that, which means that I put it on the label. It's right up front. They know what they're getting into. And that gives them opportunity to select to maybe not play this game or to talk to me about it so that we can make sure that we have fun. Because even when you're dealing with these heavy, dark concepts, we still want it to be fun, and we still want everybody to feel safe and to have a good time. And that's what this process is all about. We need to critically analyze our stories, look for the tropes, look for the stereotypes, and figure out how to add nuance and complexity to make the game more interesting. And I'm so excited that next time we get to talk about villains, because this may surprise you. The Mad Queen is not actually a villain in my game. So I also did some cool little drawings for next week. So I look forward to talking to you again, and thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.